Senator Heller.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I apologize that I missed your opening statements. I had two other committees, three committees going on at the same time, Mr. Chairman. So I'm glad I was able to make it back, and I'm certainly pleased that you and the ranking member are holding this hearing today as to how important it is. I want to kind of take this from the 30,000-foot level. To make sure we're all doing this for all the right reasons. There was a Wall Street Journal poll that came out today that said that the president's approval rating's at 51%. And I'm trying to figure out how a president's approval rating at 51% can be attained when we only had 0.5% growth in the first quarter. I mean, under any other president, under any other time, you'd probably see approval ratings to be much less. So what I'm assuming is that the administration has done a great job talking about this being the new normal. This is where we are, and people are tired of it. After 8 to 10 years seeing no growth, perhaps this is where we are in America today. We can talk about global competitiveness, we can talk about inversions, we can talk about integration, we can talk about all these issues, but if the American people believe that 0.5% is the new normal, how do we push back? So I guess my question to the panel here today, and I know maybe it's a little off topic, but I'd certainly like to get your input. One, is this a new normal? And two, if you don't believe it is, what can we do? What can we do to expand our global competitiveness? Start with you, Mr. Warren.
I certainly hope it's not the new normal. It is a little off the subject, but nonetheless, I think I'd say a couple of things. I think one of the things that we have to think about are rates, particularly rates for U.S. companies as compared to companies abroad. I think we have to think about the comparison of rates between individuals and companies. And finally, I think we have to think about the tax base and whether or not we need some additional revenue source.
Ms. Laura.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'm sort of looking at this from more of an economic standpoint and thinking about the fact that we've been operating in a low interest rate environment for so long. Now, the short end of the curve, we saw a bump in December with the Fed's raise in rates, but yet the long end still remains depressed. The real question is, why is that? And my colleagues and I have written, particularly one colleague of mine has written many articles on that, describing that while the short-term rate is rising through measures that the Fed is using, at the end of the day, there's no long-term growth that we see in the economy. We don't see any sort of dot-com growth or any sort of tech bubble that is occurring or real estate bubble that is occurring. And so as a result, we're not seeing this amount of growth that we need to see to jumpstart the economy. Thank you.
Well, I will join the other witnesses in hoping that this is not the new normal. I think what I would suggest is comprehensive business tax reform with a reduction in the corporate rate financed by elimination of what people might consider to be distortive tax incentives, and a revision of our international rules to make our companies more competitive overseas and in the United States. I mean, one reason why inversions occur is because foreign-based multinationals have substantial competitive advantages in the United States compared to U.S. multinationals. So now, having said that, I think you have to, be fairly realistic in your expectations. I'm not certain that's going to bump up economic growth dramatically. The experience of the 1986 Act was that it improved things by getting rid of some distortions, but it was very difficult to see an impact on long-term growth. I think investments in the United States in education, infrastructure, et cetera, is necessary to increase growth rates.
Well, our U.S.-based multinationals have significant money offshore, and as Ms. Lurie noted in her written testimony, a lot of U.S. companies right now, because of our current tax system, are borrowing in the United States to pay dividends to their shareholders while keeping that cash offshore. One of the major advantages of a dividends paid deduction, any integration approach, but particularly a dividends paid deduction, is that hopefully it will have a positive effect on this so-called lockout problem. Companies can bring back dividends from their low-tax offshore subsidiaries and then pay it out to their shareholders in the form of a deductible dividend that wipes out the repatriation tax that Ms. Lurie was referring to, thereby obviating the need to borrow simply to pay cash dividends. I think that is one thing that could enhance growth.
Thank you. Mr. Buckley, I do have a follow-up question. Your effort on the Ways and Means Committee. Integration is not a new topic. I think previous administrations have discussed this particular issue. Why in the past has it failed?
You know, I think it has failed, and I'm speaking of like 40 years of discussing this issue. And indeed, it goes further back than that. My law school professor was quite passionate on the issue when I went to law school. It is largely because of opposition from the corporate community, or indifference, that they do not want to have an incentive to distribute earnings. They would prefer to grow their business, retain earnings. And also, it has been because there are other alternatives that have been far more attractive to the business community, otherwise known as a corporate rate reduction. In 1986, the United States Senate rejected a dividend paid deduction that was included in the House-passed version of the '86 reform and substituted a slightly larger reduction in the corporate rate that was greeted with a great deal of joy from the corporate community.
Thank you. If you'll indulge me just 1 minute, Mr. Chairman, for
Well,
one.
let me just interrupt. Mr. Warren, would you give your impression on that same question?
The last time this was seriously considered was in the '90s. I think the corporate community was not enthusiastic about it, but I think we're in a very different world now with competition from abroad and so on. So I actually think that the fact that integration has failed to get the political momentum behind it in the past is not a reason not to take it very seriously now, given that we're in a very different world.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the follow-up. I just wanted to ask one more follow-up to Mr. Buckley, and that is, do you believe that the Treasury Administration's new rules will fix these international competitive problems that we have?
Are you talking about the regulatory action?
385s?
I think it slightly reduces the opportunity for income stripping out of the United States, but only slightly. I think this committee has to look at a much broader solution to the question of collecting a full corporate income tax on income that is actually earned here and not diverted through interest payments or royalty payments to low-tax jurisdictions overseas.
Mr. Buckley, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks for the follow-up.